Make no mistake, the best data analyses, the most impactful data analyses are born from the best data. When it comes to Python and Excel, you have two powerful options for crafting the best data for your analyses. You have Power Query and you have SQL, or what is commonly referred to as SQL. Now here's the thing. These technologies, both of them at a high level, basically do the same thing. They provide you the same kinds of functionality for crafting the best data for your analyses. So the question is, which should you be using for Python and Excel? As it turns out, that answer is highly dependent on your situation, because these two technologies have their own pros and cons, and you need to evaluate those pros and cons vis-a-vis where your organization is at. I will be covering these pros and cons later on in the video, and if you're already familiar with SQL or Power Query, please use the video chapters below to navigate to the portions of the video that are useful to you. And for those of you that are still watching right now, I'm going to go ahead and do quick introductions into Power Query and SQL so that everyone is level set regarding these two technologies. So we're off to Excel. So here I am in Excel, and what I have here is a very common situation that you're going to run into as you evolve your analytics using Python and Excel, as you move into more and more sophisticated analytics. And that's a situation where you have multiple tables of data in your workbook. And this data comes from the Microsoft AdventureWorks sample database, but it represents a very common type of scenario that you'll run into in Python and Excel. So you can see here I have reseller sales, I have product data, I have resellers, all this kind of thing. In traditional Excel world, this would be the purview of using things like XLOOKUP or VLOOKUP or index match to join up these tables, to merge them together. However, a better option, quite frankly, is to use Power Query. And what you can see here on this particular tab is a table, notice it's a different color, that was generated from using Power Query. So what it did was it merged all of those other three tables together, did some filtering, removed some columns to result at this particular individual data set. So what I want to do is show you Power Query and give you a brief introduction, super high level brief introduction. So what we can do here is we can go to the data part of the ribbon and then click on queries and connections. And what we can see here is that I've created a number of Power Query connections and queries. So what we've got here are ones that correspond to each of my tables that we saw earlier: reseller sales, products, and resellers. What I've done is I've made all of the Power Query data wrangling, all the transformations and all the filtering and stuff be part of this particular query. So if I double click that, I can bring up Power Query. And this is the Power Query editor. And at a high level, Power Query provides you a way to build automations, that is, automatic ways to acquire data, filter data, clean data, create new columns from the data, do all kinds of data manipulation, all kinds of data wrangling. What it does is behind the scenes is it uses something called M code to do this. And what it creates is what is commonly referred to as a data pipeline, or a series of repeatable steps. And this is super awesome because a lot of folks use formulas and functions inside their worksheets to do all this stuff. And the problem is that it's not very repeatable. It's not very automated. And this is what Power Query is for. And what you can see here is that Power Query provides a nice graphical user interface, something known as a GUI, to allow you to create these data pipelines, these step-by-step transformations of your source data into the final product that you want. And what you can see here is the final results. This corresponds to that green table that you just saw right here. But what's most important is these applied steps. Because notice what's happening here is you can see that the source data was the reseller sales table, and then Power Query does some things to the data to manipulate it to make it work for Power Query. That's what this change type means. And then you can see all of the steps that I've added. For example, I've joined or merged the products table. So if you're more familiar with Excel functions, think VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, index match, that sort of thing. Same with this. And then what I do is I expand those tables of columns out. And then what I do here is I actually remove some of the rows by filtering down. And then I can select only the columns that I want. For example, if I go to this particular step right here and I click on it, what I get is what the table would look like when this step and all of the others have been executed. And what you can see here is I have so many columns. So I have some from the products table. Notice there is this products.size unit measure code. This tells me that this particular column came from the products table and it's been merged up with the resellers table. And if I keep scrolling, you can see here I have, this is the reseller data from the resellers table. So what I've got is 3 tables worth of columns all merged or joined together. And I can then say, okay, well, if I go to this step right here, I then apply a filter to the revision num column, and I only keep the rows where the revision num column has a value of 1 in each cell, and I get rid of everything else. This is known as a filter. And then lastly, what I do here is I just select the columns that I want. And what I get is a much smaller list of columns, because these are the only columns that I need. And once again, this corresponds to what we saw in the green table. This is just a super quick introduction to Power Query. It can do a heck of a lot more than this. For example, it's got functionality and features specifically designed for dealing with common data formatting issues that you see in worksheets where people don't actually put data in a nice clean table. Power Query has functionality to help you massage that worksheet data and get it into a tabular format like this, which is what you actually need for Python and Excel. So what I'll do is I'll put one of my favorite Power Query books. I'll put a link to it to Amazon down below in the description. It's not a referral link. I don't make any money or anything off of it. I just want to give you that resource in case you're interested. It's a great book on Power Query. It will go into a lot more detail about what's possible. But in general, this is a great example of what you will commonly do to prep your data for analysis in Python and Excel, and Power Query is an excellent option for that. Don't freak out. I want to introduce you to a very good friend of mine, that I've known for more than 20 years now. Structured Query Language, or SQL, or as it's commonly referred to, SQL. If you're not familiar, SQL is the language of databases. It is a programming language specifically designed for acquiring data, merging data, cleaning data, generating new columns of data, all the kinds of things to pre-process your data so that you have the best data for your analyses. This is commonly referred to in certain circles as data wrangling. I'm wrangling my data into a format that I need. And SQL is exceedingly powerful. It has been around for a very, very long time, and it will continue to be around for a very, very long time. Now, I can't go into SQL in this video. No way. It's too big of a topic. That being said, if you like what you see and if you're interested in learning more about SQL, I do have a tutorial series on my channel, and I'll put a card to the videos up here, that teaches Excel users specifically how to use SQL. What I do in the tutorial is I take your Excel knowledge and then I map it to SQL. So what I have here is a SQL query that produces the same results as we saw in the previous chapter on Power Query. That green table that we saw in the Excel workbook, that result of Power Query data wrangling, this SQL code does exactly the same thing. And like I said at the very beginning of the video, at a high level, Power Query and SQL do the same thing. This is a great example of it. So what we can see here is the SQL query. And if I run this, what I get back is a tabular shape of the data. Once again, that looks just like that green table that we saw in the previous chapter. Same number of columns, same number of rows. I'm just using code here, SQL code, instead of the point-and-click GUI interface of Power Query to make this, but essentially it produces the same thing. Now here's what's awesome. SQL works against the database server. Right now I'm using SQL Server on my local laptop for this video, but in the real world, most organizations, the IT department has databases running on very big, large, powerful computers. And you send SQL up to that large, powerful computer and it runs there and the results are returned. So essentially what you're doing is you're offloading the work. Power Query has to do that on your laptop locally, but SQL allows you to offload the work, and that can be immensely useful in so many scenarios, especially when you're dealing with non-trivial initial data sets, very big data sets that you then kind of whittle down to smaller data sets. You can use the database server to do that, which is great. Now, I'm using SQL Server here, just so that you know, even if you don't use SQL Server in your organization, SQL is a very transferable skill. Generally speaking, if you learn SQL for one technology, let's say Microsoft SQL Server, like you see here, you're 80 to 90% of the way of learning SQL on another technology, like Oracle or Snowflake or whatever it might, Databricks, whatever it might be, because SQL is very standardized. There are some subtle nuances depending on what technology you use, but those are very quickly learned. The bulk of SQL remains the same no matter what technology you use. Makes it a very highly transferable, highly valuable skill. And the best thing about SQL is that you actually can use it directly from Power Query, and then you can then feed data from the database via Power Query directly into Python and Excel. And let me show you what that looks like. Okay, here I am in Excel. If you watch the previous chapter, you'll notice that that's the green table here, right here being displayed, which comes from the result of the Power Query data wrangling or data pipeline. And what you can see here is I've created another connection called Reseller Sales SQL. Now, if I open this up, it's a little hard to tell what's going on, but let me show you. It's going to run the query and pull the data. But what's going on here is very, very specific. Notice up here that we use SQL.database. And this is the Power Query M code that says, look, we're not actually going to do anything directly in Power Query. We're actually going to connect to a database, and fire SQL at it. And you can see here, this part right here is the query. That's the actual SQL. The same code that you just saw actually embedded in the Power Query connection. And what this means is that Power Query becomes a pass-through mechanism. So you have your database server on one side, and then you access the data there. You get it, you merge it, you filter it, you clean it, you create new columns, you do whatever you need to do. It then passes through Power Query into Python and Excel. And if you want a more detailed demonstration of what that looks like, I've got another video on my channel. I'll put a card up here, which shows me importing 300,000 rows of data, over 300,000 rows of data from a database into Python and Excel via Power Query. So you can watch that video if you want more details. But this is awesome, right? So this provides you the choice. You can either use Power Query for everything that you need, as we saw in the last chapter, or you could say, look, I'm just going to use SQL instead. Granted, that both of these technologies, once again at a high level, provide similar functionality. You need to ask yourself, which should you use vis-a-vis your situation? And that's all based on the pros and cons of each tech, which I'm going to cover next. All right, let's start talking about the pros and cons of each of these technologies now that we've had a brief introduction. First up, let's talk about Power Query and the pros. So first up, not surprisingly, Power Query is a built-in feature of Excel, and that's nice. That means most professionals have access to it already. Depending on how your IT runs things, it being built into Excel can be a very strong pro. Another pro is, as we saw in the introduction, it provides rich, robust data wrangling functionality. It provides you the ability to acquire data, clean it, filter it, create new columns of data based on other columns, all the kinds of things that you would expect. So it's fully featured in terms of data wrangling, which is exactly what you need to get the most out of Python and Excel. The GUI, the graphical user interface for Python and Excel, is extremely easy to learn. That's a plus for a lot of folks that might not necessarily want to learn a programming language, or they find that intimidating for whatever reason. Another big pro of Power Query is the fact that it supports many, many data sources. You can source data from Excel workbooks. You can source data from databases, from APIs. So you can scrape websites. There's just a ton of things that you can source data from out of the box with Power Query, which makes it really, really nice. Not surprisingly, Power Query is the best for Excel data. It provides features and functionality specifically designed to address the common data formatting issues that you see all the time in Excel worksheets. So if your data is predominantly coming from Excel workbooks, this is a huge pro. But not everything's rosy, okay? Every technology has trade-offs, and Power Query is the same as any other technology. So here are the cons. First up, you might need to learn the M programming language. What actually ends up happening is you use the GUI in Power Query, and what it's doing is it's generating a programming language known as M. It's generating M code. And not everything that M can do is actually available via the GUI. So you might run into situations where you need to do a particular data cleaning or particular data transformation, and you just can't do it with out-of-the-box GUI functionality, and you'll need to learn M. So just keep that in the back of your mind. If you want the full power of Power Query, eventually you have to drop down into M code. Next up, as a con, we have limited scalability. Compared to regular traditional Excel tables and worksheets, Power Query is very scalable. However, in the greater scheme of things, you have to remember that Power Query runs on your laptop, so it's limited to the resources that your laptop has. For example, how much memory. As we'll see later on with the SQL pros and cons, SQL doesn't have that because usually you're running your SQL queries against the database server, which is usually far more powerful than your laptop. Another con is, despite how awesome Power Query is, quite frankly, and this always makes me sad, very few Excel users actually know it. So that is a con, right? It's just something to keep in mind. As compared to using standard functions and formulas in your worksheets, very few Excel users know Power Query. And also, it's not a universal data skill. And what I mean by this is if you go look for data-related job descriptions on the internet, very rarely are you going to find Power Query listed as a skill that employers are looking for. Compared to SQL, as we'll see next up, that's not the case. SQL is requested everywhere. It's probably the single most commonly requested data skill behind Excel in the real world. So those are your pros and cons. And this is going to be super important for understanding which you should be using with Python and Excel. So keep this in the back of your mind. All right, next up, we have structured query language, or SQL, or as I call it, and a lot of people call it, SQL. So what are the pros of SQL? First up, SQL is the lingua franca of data. And what I mean by this is any database technology, any data storage technology that is commonly used in organizations around the world has the ability to support SQL. Traditional databases, that's big data solutions, small data solutions, cloud databases, and everything in between. Okay, so it is the lingua franca of data. It is a highly transferable skill. One of the best things about SQL, as I mentioned previously, is you can learn one SQL dialect, for example, the dialect of Microsoft SQL Server, and about 80-90% of the way to using SQL with any technology because SQL is fairly standardized. So it is the lingua franca. SQL, like Power Query, provides full data wrangling capabilities. You can acquire data, you can clean data, you can filter data, you can create new columns of data, all these kinds of things. SQL is extremely powerful. Believe it or not, SQL is actually quite easy to learn. And in fact, it's very easy for Excel users to learn. Next up, and this one's a big pro, is that SQL runs against the server. Power Query runs locally, just like Excel on your laptop. But typically when you're using SQL, you're contacting a database server, a cloud database, or whatever. And these machines, these computers have tons of memory, tons of CPU, very fast disks, all this kind of stuff. So you're going to scale far beyond anything that you can do in Power Query. In the next step, you can almost always bet that the most valuable data in organizations are stored in databases, especially relational databases, things like SQL Server, Oracle, Postgres, MySQL. So if you know SQL, and you can get access to the databases, you get access to the crown jewels of data within your organization. So that's a big pro. And then lastly, SQL is a universal data skill. If you think about all the data skills that are on job descriptions from all the companies around the world, number one is typically Excel. And the number two is SQL. Because SQL, being the lingua franca of data, is not surprisingly, it's a very valuable universal skill. So folks that have access to SQL, have learned how to use SQL, typically find that it's immensely valuable. It's one of the most valuable things that they learn how to do. Every technology has pros and cons, so not all is rosy in SQL land here. First up is that SQL is a programming language. Make no mistake, some people debate this, but trust me, I've got a master's in computer science. It is, in fact, a programming language by any regular definition. And that can be a problem. Some people just don't want to learn a programming language for whatever reason. Maybe they feel intimidated by it, or they just simply just don't want to. They're like, look, Dave, I'm far enough in my career now. I don't want to worry about it. That's totally cool. It is a con. I just want to make sure I bring it up. Next up is limited data sources. And I mean this in relation to Power Query specifically. Any very popular data storage technology that's in common use supports SQL. So from that perspective, you don't have limited data sources. However, you're limited insofar as you're talking about data storage technologies. For example, Power Query can source data from an API. Power Query can actually scrape a web page for you. SQL doesn't do that. SQL only works with data storage technology. So that's what I mean by this right here. Another con is you have to be able to access a database. This is a big one. Okay, depending on your organization, depending on how your IT department runs, maybe this is okay. Maybe they will allow you to do read-only queries to pull data, and they're fine with that. But a lot of organizations are just like, no way. You work in marketing. You don't need access to the database. So no, we're not going to give it to you. So if you can't get access to the DB, you're kind of dead in the water. And then lastly, few Excel users know it. Even fewer Excel users know SQL compared to Power Query. So these are all the cons and pros of SQL. And you can see here that essentially that while Power Query and SQL can do the same things, they actually have very important differences. And we're going to talk about what that means in terms of which one you should be using next. All right, now we can answer the question of whether you should be using Power Query or SQL with Python and Excel. And not surprisingly, the answer is based on the pros and cons of the technologies vis-a-vis your situation. So the first question you have to ask yourself is this: does most, if not all of my data come in the form of Excel workbooks? If the answer is yes, then Power Query is the ticket for you, because Power Query offers features that are optimized for sourcing data from Excel workbooks, including addressing common data formatting issues that you see all the time in Excel worksheets. And after that, you have to ask yourself this: hey, I have databases in my organization and they contain valuable data for me to use, but I have to have access. Can you get that access? And if the answer is no, well, there you go. Power Query is the ticket, because SQL without a database is essentially useless. And then lastly, you arrive in the situation where, Dave, not all of my data comes in the form of Excel workbooks. I can get access to databases in my organization. I can get read-only query access. Then the answer is SQL. More often than not, there is no downside for learning SQL. Not only is it one of the most, if not the most in-demand data skills, it is also one of the most long-lived. I've been using SQL hands-on since the 1990s, and I will be using SQL until I retire. It's that powerful. It's that ubiquitous. It's that useful. In fact, in my long career in technology, like 27 years now, I can only think of one other tech that has similar characteristics to SQL, and that's Excel itself. Technologies come and go, but Excel and SQL are here to stay, and they're like chocolate and peanut butter, better together. So if you're interested in upping your data game with skills in SQL, remember to check out that card for my SQL tutorial series here on my YouTube channel. It's specifically designed for Excel users. All right, that's it for this video. My next video will cover the most powerful, the most awesome use case in Python and Excel, and that is applying machine learning to analyze your business data. So the topic of my next video will be the best machine learning techniques for any professional, including you, to learn to have more impact with data. When that video is ready, it'll show up here as a tile, and you can click on it and watch it. And in the meantime, what I'll do is put up another one of my Python and Excel machine learning videos, and you can watch that if you're interested. Okay, until next time, please stay healthy, and I wish you very happy data sleuthing.